Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great built the largest empire the world had ever seen up to that point, stretching from the Aegean coast of Anatolia all the way to the edges of Central Asia. And he did it through a combination of military brilliance, political generosity, and a genuine willingness to let conquered peoples keep their customs and their gods. He freed the Jews from Babylonian captivity. He is praised in the Hebrew Bible. He is called the father of his nation in Iranian tradition. And according to the Greek historian Herodotus, he ended his life with his severed head stuffed inside a skin filled with human blood. The campaign that killed him was against the Masajdi, a nomadic Scythian people who lived in the steppes of what is now Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, led by their queen, Tomyris. Cyrus had already tried the diplomatic route, proposing marriage to Tomyris, which she reportedly rejected as a transparent attempt to absorb her kingdom. So he marched. His forces initially scored a significant success, crossing the Araxes River and ambushing a portion of the Masajdi army, during which Tomyris' son, Spargapises, was captured. Spargapises later killed himself in captivity, and Tomyris, by Herodotus' account, sent Cyrus a message that was not subtle. "Give back my son and leave, or I will give you more blood than you can drink." Cyrus did not leave. The second battle was catastrophic for the Persians. Herodotus describes it as the fiercest battle ever fought between non-Greek peoples, a grinding, close-quarters slaughter after the arrows ran out. Cyrus was killed, his army devastated. Tomyris, according to Herodotus, then found his body and submerged his head in a vessel of blood, saying he had thirsted for blood his whole life, and now he could drink his fill. Herodotus himself acknowledges this is only one of several accounts of the death in circulation, and modern historians approach the blood vessel detail with considerable skepticism, noting it reads more like a moral fable about hubris than a verified historical record. What is not disputed is that Cyrus died somewhere in Central Asia around 530 BC, likely in battle, likely in his late 60s, and that the shock of losing the founder of the empire in the field reverberated through Persian society for generations. He had no clean succession plan. His son Cambyses II inherited an empire still grieving, and the cracks appeared almost immediately. Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquered more of the known world before the age of 30 than most rulers managed in a full lifetime, and then he died in Babylon at 32 in a bed, over the course of 12 days, and nobody's entirely sure why. He had just returned from his eastern campaigns, having pushed his Macedonian army through Persia, Egypt, Bactria, and into the Punjab in modern Pakistan, places that no Greek army had ever reached. He was planning new campaigns, possibly into Arabia. He attended a banquet at the house of a Macedonian noble named Medius of Larissa, drank heavily by most accounts, and began feeling ill shortly afterward. What followed was recorded in fragments known as the Royal Diaries, a document whose authenticity is debated but which describes the progression of his illness in clinical terms. A fever, then worsening fever, then increasing weakness, difficulty walking, loss of speech, and finally unresponsiveness. He died on June 10th or 11th, 323 BC, according to most chronologies, with his generals filing past his bed one by one while he could apparently still recognize them but could no longer speak. The cause of death has been argued over by historians and physicians ever since. Ancient sources including Arrian, Plutarch, and Diodorus Siculus all wrote about his death, and poisoning rumors circulated almost immediately, with Antipater's family most frequently named as suspects. The most commonly proposed poison in modern times has been white hellebore, which contains the alkaloid veratrine and could produce the described symptoms, but the case for deliberate poisoning remains circumstantial at best. Typhoid fever complicated by bowel perforation is the theory favored by many medical historians, particularly because typhoid was endemic in the ancient Near East and the Babylonian water supply was not pristine. In 2019, Dr. Catherine Hall of the University of Otago proposed Guillain-Barré syndrome as a possibility, a neurological condition that could explain one of the strangest details in the ancient accounts. Multiple sources suggest Alexander's body showed no signs of decomposition for approximately 6 days after his death, which Hall argued could indicate he was not actually dead, but in a state of profound paralysis, a genuinely disturbing thought. West Nile virus has also been proposed, given that Babylon sits in a region where the disease was present and birds were reportedly dying in the city around the time of his illness. His death without a legitimate heir produced an immediate catastrophe. When asked who should inherit his empire, he reportedly said, "To the strongest," or said nothing at all, depending on the source. What followed was 40 years of warfare among his generals, the Diadochi, that shattered everything he had built into competing kingdoms that spent the next century bleeding each other. Hannibal Barca. Hannibal Barca never lost a battle to Rome on Italian soil. He crossed the Alps in 218 BC with war elephants and a multinational army, spent 15 years ravaging the Italian peninsula, destroyed. Roman armies at the Trebia River, Lake Trasimene, and most devastatingly at Cannae in 216 BC, where somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers died in a single afternoon in what remains a textbook study in encirclement tactics taught at military academies to this day. And yet Rome did not fall. Carthage failed to support him adequately. Rome rebuilt its armies with grim determination, and Hannibal was eventually recalled to Africa, where Scipio Africanus defeated him at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. What followed was decades of humiliation, flight, and exile that ended not with a sword in his chest on a battlefield, but with poison swallowed in a small house in Bithynia, in the corner of the world that is now northwestern Turkey, surrounded by Roman soldiers who had finally, after years of pursuit, blocked every exit. After Carthage's defeat, Hannibal had tried to reform Carthaginian politics, which earned him enemies at home as well as abroad, and he eventually fled, first to the Seleucid court where he served Antiochus III, then, after Antiochus's defeat by Rome, to the court of King Prusias I of Bithynia, where he served as a military advisor. Rome's relentless diplomatic pressure to hand him over eventually succeeded. The Roman envoy Titus Quinctius Flamininus arrived, and Hannibal found his villa surrounded. According to both Livy and Plutarch, Hannibal had long kept poison hidden in a ring or small vessel for exactly this contingency. His reported last words, as Livy records them in paraphrase, were something to the effect of, "Let us relieve the Romans of their anxiety, since they find it too long to wait for an old man's death." He drank the poison and died around 183 BC, aged approximately 64. The same year, by most chronologies, Scipio Africanus also died in voluntary exile from Rome, disgusted with Roman politics. Ancient writers found the symmetry almost too perfect. The two greatest military minds of their age dying in the same year, both essentially discarded by the societies they had served. Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was handed at least 3 separate warnings on the morning of March 15th, 44 BC, and ignored all of them. A soothsayer named Spurina had told him weeks earlier to beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia had dreamed of his murder and begged him not to go to the Senate meeting. A written note was pressed into his hand as he arrived at the theater of Pompey, where the Senate was temporarily meeting while the Curia Hostilia was under renovation, and Caesar put the note in his left hand, intending to read it later. He never read it. The conspiracy against him involved somewhere between 23 and 60 men, depending on the ancient source consulted, organized primarily by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, who had convinced themselves and their allies that killing Caesar was an act of republican virtue rather than political murder. The attack began when a senator named Tullius Cimber approached Caesar under the pretense of petitioning for his exiled brother and grabbed Caesar's toga, the signal for the others to draw their blades. What followed was chaotic rather than choreographed. Ancient sources record Caesar fighting back initially, using his stylus to stab at his attackers before being overwhelmed. He was stabbed 23 times. A physician named Antistius reportedly examined the body afterward and concluded that only one wound had been fatal, the second stab to the chest, which had penetrated between the ribs into vital organs. Modern forensic analysis has broadly supported this conclusion, suggesting that most of the other wounds were shallow, partly because the conspirators were crowded together and partly because several of them, in the chaos, may have accidentally stabbed each other. Caesar reportedly pulled his toga over his face as he fell, either to die with some dignity or, as one ancient tradition suggests, because he saw Brutus among the attackers and did not wish to watch. The famous line, "Et tu, Brute," is entirely Shakespeare's invention, written in 1599, over 1600 years after the fact. The Roman historian Suetonius mentions a Greek phrase, kai su teknon, meaning something like "you too, child," but even Suetonius treats it as an uncertain report. The assassination achieved the opposite of what the conspirators intended. Within 3 years, Brutus and Cassius were both dead. The Roman Republic was effectively finished. War and the civil wars that followed would produce Augustus Caesar, Rome's first emperor, establishing the imperial system the conspirators had killed Caesar to prevent. Attila the Hun. Attila the Hun spent decades being the most terrifying man in the known world. He ravaged the Balkans multiple times, extorted vast sums from the Eastern Roman Empire, invaded Gaul, and was only stopped at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 AD in one of the bloodiest engagements of late antiquity, and then invaded Italy the following year, sacking cities and sending the Pope himself, Leo I, to negotiate with him at the river Mincio. He died on his wedding night. The primary account comes from Priscus, a Roman diplomat who had actually visited Attila's court in person, and whose writings survive in fragments quoted by the later historian Jordanes. According to this account, Attila had taken a new wife, a young woman named Ildiko, described as a Germanic noblewoman, and celebrated the marriage with a characteristically enormous feast involving heavy drinking. He retired to his tent with his new bride. The next morning, when he did not emerge and did not respond to attendants, they forced their way in and found him dead. Ildiko was crouched weeping beside the body. There was no visible wound. The ancient sources describe blood flowing from his nose and throat, which had pooled rather than draining properly because he was lying on his back unconscious. The most medically plausible explanation is a severe nosebleed, combined with acute alcohol intoxication. Heavy drinking causes vasodilation and can trigger or worsen epistaxis, and an unconscious person on their back can asphyxiate on the blood. Some medical historians have proposed esophageal varices, burst blood vessels in the esophagus caused by years of heavy drinking, as an alternative. Ildiko was initially suspected of murder. The optics were not good, but no ancient source seriously pursues that case, and the physical evidence described by Priscus fits an accidental death more neatly. The consequences were immediate and total. Attila's sons, of whom he had many, immediately began fighting each other for primacy, and the subject, peoples of the Hunnic Empire, Germanic tribes, and others who had been held down by military force alone, rose in revolt. Within a few years of 453 AD, the Hunnic Empire had ceased to exist. The scourge of God was gone, and without him there was nothing holding his empire together at all. Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan built the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world, roughly 24 million square kilometers at its peak. And the manner of his death is one of the most deliberately obscured facts in all of medieval history, because the Mongols made sure of it. He died in the summer of 1227, most likely, on August 18th, while conducting a campaign against the Western Xia dynasty in what is now the Ningxia region of northwestern China. The secret history of the Mongols, the primary Mongolian source on his life, is conspicuously vague about the circumstances. His death was kept secret from the army and from the wider world while the campaign concluded. His body transported thousands of miles back across the steppe, and according to tradition, everyone who encountered the funeral procession was killed to prevent the location of his grave from becoming known. No verified burial site has ever been found, despite modern archaeological searches using satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar. As for what actually killed him, the leading theory among historians is injuries sustained from a fall from his horse during a hunt in 1226, possibly internal bleeding or infection that worsened over months. He would have been approximately 65 at the time of his death, old by the standards of a man who had spent his entire adult life on campaign in brutal conditions. A persistent legend, appearing in some sources but generally classified as folklore, holds that he was wounded in the genitals or knee by a captive Xixia queen who concealed a weapon, and that this wound killed him. Other proposed causes include typhoid, plague, and, in a 2023 study, malaria. None of these can be confirmed given the deliberate erasure of the evidence. What followed his death was managed succession, by Mongol imperial standards, with Ögedei Khan taking over and continuing the expansion, but the seeds of eventual fragmentation were already present. The empire his sons and grandsons built was vast and impressive, but none of them were Genghis Khan, and the Mongol Empire began its slow process of division into successor khanate within 2 generations of his death. Tamerlane. Tamerlane, known formally as Timur, built an empire across Central Asia, Persia, the Caucasus, and northern India in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, doing so with a ferocity that left pyramids of skulls outside the cities he conquered, a practice documented by contemporaries and not considered an exaggeration by historians. He defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, capturing him and reportedly keeping him in a cage, a humiliation unprecedented for an Ottoman ruler. By the winter of 1404, he was preparing what would have been the largest military operation of his career, an invasion of Ming China. His army numbered in the hundreds of thousands. He was approximately 68 years old. Shuiz had been lame in his right leg and injured in his right arm since his early career, giving him his Western title Tamerlane, a corruption of Timur the Lame, and by most contemporary accounts was seriously ill when the march began. He made it as far as Otterair, a city in what is now southern Kazakhstan, before his condition became critical. He died there on February 18, 1405, of a severe fever. The China campaign halted before it truly began. His body was embalmed in musk and rosewater and transported to Samarkand, where it was interred in the Gurea Mir, a mausoleum of extraordinary beauty faced in luminous blue and turquoise tilework that still stands today. In 1941, the Soviet anthropologist Mikhail Gerasimov received permission to exhume the tomb and examine the remains. What he found confirmed the historical descriptions precisely. A tall male skeleton, lame in the right leg, injured right arm, consistent with Timur's known physical characteristics. Then there is the matter of the inscription reportedly found inside the tomb, which warned that whoever disturbed the remains would unleash a great war. Gerasimov opened the tomb on June 19th and 20th, 1941. Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. Historians treat this as a coincidence of remarkable timing. Nothing more, but it is one of those coincidences that history declines to let go of. The planned China invasion died with Timur and the Timurid Empire that followed, while producing extraordinary art, architecture, and scholarship centered on Samarkand and Herat, never attempted that scale of conquest again. Mehmed II. Mehmed II was 51 years old and had been planning his next conquest when he died, which is perhaps the most fitting summary of a man who spent his entire reign in motion. He had conquered Constantinople in 1453 at the age of 21, ending the Byzantine Empire after over 1,000 years of continuous existence and destroying the last institutional link to ancient Rome. He went on to conquer large portions of the Balkans, most of Anatolia, the Crimea, and he had recently achieved something that genuinely terrified the papacy in all of Italy. An Ottoman force had landed at Otranto in southern Italy in 1480 and established a foothold on the Italian peninsula. The planned follow-up campaign, which many contemporaries believed was aimed at Rome itself, never came. Mehmed died on May 3, 1481, near Gebze in northwestern Turkey, on campaign, aged 49, of what most historians attribute to gout complicated by acute illness, possibly dysentery or a systemic infection. He had suffered from gout for years, a painful and debilitating condition that affected his mobility significantly in his later reign. Almost immediately, rumors of poisoning began circulating in Ottoman circles, with suspicion falling on his personal physician, a Jewish doctor known as Yaqub Pasha, or Maestro Jacopo, who was accused by some Ottoman factions of administering a fatal dose of medicine under the direction of political rivals. The accusation appears in some Ottoman chronicles, but has never been substantiated. What happened next illustrates the razor-thin line between a conqueror's life and geopolitical stability. Within days of Mehmed's death, the Ottoman forces at Otranto received orders to withdraw and sailed home. Italy was saved not by crusade or military resistance, but by the death of one man. Mehmed's body was also prepared at Gebze, a location with a strange historical echo, since Gebze occupies the same general area as ancient Labissa in Bithynia, the place where Hannibal had taken poison to avoid Roman capture 16 centuries earlier. Whether anyone at the time noted the coincidence is not recorded. Hernán Cortés. Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire, one of the most powerful states in the pre-Columbian Americas, with a force that at its lowest point numbered fewer than 500 men, through a combination of tactical brilliance, devastating use of Spanish steel and horses, catastrophic Aztec losses to smallpox, and crucially, an alliance with tens of thousands of indigenous peoples who hated the Aztec Empire and saw the Spanish as a potential means of liberation. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, which Cortés entered for the first time in 1519, was by most estimates larger than any city in Spain at the time, a city of canals and floating gardens and pyramids that left even hardened Spanish soldiers speechless when they first saw it from the surrounding causeways. Cortés spent his later years expecting Spain to reward him proportionately for what he had done. Instead, he found himself progressively sidelined, denied the governorships he wanted, outmaneuvered by colonial administrators appointed by the crown, which was deeply suspicious of any conquistador who had demonstrated the capacity to build personal power bases in the New World. He funded multiple expeditions along the Pacific coast of Mexico and into Baja California at enormous personal expense, finding no further treasure and accruing substantial debt. He traveled to Spain twice to petition King Charles I, and on at least one occasion reportedly pushed through a crowd to reach the king's carriage, and when Charles asked who he was, answered that he was a man who had given the king more kingdoms than his ancestors had left him cities, an exchange that appears in several biographies, but whose precise sourcing historians note with caution. He died at his estate in Castilleja de la Cuesta, near Seville, on December 2, 1547, aged 62, of pleurisy, likely worsened by dysentery. His will requested that his remains be returned to New Spain. They eventually were, after considerable delay and multiple relocations, and today they rest in the Hospital de Jesus Nazareno in Mexico City, a hospital that Cortés himself founded, which is the oldest continuously operating hospital in the Americas. Francisco Pizarro. Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca Empire, the largest empire in pre-Columbian American history, stretching 4,000 kilometers along the western coast of South America, with an initial force of fewer than 200 men, achieving his decisive victory at the Battle of Cajamarca in 1532, where he captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa through a surprise attack of extraordinary audacity and ruthlessness. He was paid an enormous ransom for Atahualpa, a room filled with gold and 2 rooms filled with silver, the largest ransom in history up to that point. And then he executed Atahualpa anyway. He founded Lima in 1535 and spent the following years trying to consolidate Spanish control over a vast and hostile territory, while simultaneously managing the increasingly bitter rivalry with his former partner and co-conqueror Diego de Almagro. The partnership ended in the civil conflict known as the War of Las Salinas in 1538, after which Pizarro had Almagro captured, tried, and garroted. He did not survive his partner by many years. On June 26, 1541, approximately 20 armed men loyal to Almagro's son, Diego de Almagro the Younger, broke into Pizarro's palace in Lima in broad daylight, cutting down his guards as they went. Pizarro, then somewhere in his mid to late 60s, his exact birth year being genuinely uncertain, with estimates ranging from 1471 to 1478, fought back. He reportedly killed 2 of the attackers with his sword before being overwhelmed, stabbed multiple times, and falling. Multiple accounts record him drawing a cross in his own blood on the floor as he lay dying and calling out for confession, though the precise sourcing of the blood cross detail warrants care. His body was reportedly buried secretly that same night. The conquest he had begun collapsed into years of further civil war among the conquistadors, eventually requiring Spain to dispatch a viceroy with an army to restore order, meaning that the Spanish Empire had to reconquer Peru from the Spaniards who had just conquered it from the Incas. Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte remade Europe. At his peak, he controlled territory from Spain to the borders of Russia, placed his brothers on the thrones of Holland, Spain, and Westphalia, and forced the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, an institution that had existed in some form for over 1,000 years. He was also a legal reformer whose Napoleonic Code forms the basis of civil law in France, Quebec, Louisiana, and dozens of other jurisdictions to this day. He died on a British-controlled rock in the South Atlantic Ocean, 800 miles from the nearest landmass, pacing the damp rooms of Longwood House on the island of St. Helena, dictating his memoirs with the obsessive energy of a man determined to control how history would judge him. He died on May 5th, 1821, age 51. The official British and French cause of death was stomach cancer, and this remains the most widely accepted explanation among mainstream medical historians. But Napoleon's death has generated more forensic controversy than almost any other historical figure, largely because of hair analysis conducted in the 1960s that found elevated levels of arsenic in preserved samples of his hair. This sparked a serious poisoning debate, with various fingers pointed at the British, at French royalist conspirators, and at specific individuals at St. Helena. The counter-argument that gained traction, and which most current historians find persuasive, involves the wallpaper at Longwood House. The walls were hung with green patterned paper containing a pigment called Scheele's green, a copper arsenite compound, and in the humid St. Helena climate, a mold called Scopulariopsis brevicalis can metabolize arsenical pigments and release arsenic as a vapor. A 2021 study by Italian researchers reaffirmed stomach cancer as the most likely primary cause, noting that the arsenic levels in Napoleon's hair were elevated but consistent across samples from different periods of his life, suggesting chronic environmental exposure rather than acute poisoning. His captivity under the British governor Sir Hudson Lowe was genuinely punishing. His title of emperor was refused. His movements were severely restricted, he was denied the company he requested, and he found the indignity of it all nearly unbearable. His reported last words included France the army Josephine, though accounts of his final moments vary between witnesses. His remains were returned to Paris in 1840 and now lie under the Golden Dome of Les Invalides in an enormous red porphyry sarcophagus, which is, one suspects, more or less how he would have wanted it. Simón Bolívar liberated more territory than almost anyone in modern history, leading campaigns across what are now Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, the last of which is named after him, fighting a revolutionary war against the Spanish Empire that lasted nearly 2 decades and involved extraordinary physical hardship, including the famous crossing of the Andes in 1819 with an army that emerged from the frozen passes to defeat a much larger Spanish force at the Battle of Boyacay and secure Colombian independence. At his peak, he governed Gran Colombia, a republic encompassing modern Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama, and served simultaneously as president of Peru. By 1830, he had watched all of it fall apart. Gran Colombia was fracturing, Venezuela and Ecuador had seceded, and Bolivar had resigned the presidency under pressure from political rivals, who had grown to see his continued presence as an obstacle rather than an asset. He had already survived one serious assassination attempt, the September Conspiracy of 1828, during which he escaped through a window of the government palace, while his companion, Manuela Sáenz, delayed the assassins at the door long enough for him to flee, an act of courage that earned her the title Liberator of the Liberator. He was planning to go into European exile when tuberculosis made that impossible. He died on December 17th, 1830, at the Quinta de San Pedro Alejandrino, a sugar estate near Santa Marta on the Colombian coast, in a borrowed bed, in a borrowed house, with few possessions remaining after decades of spending his personal fortune on the liberation campaigns. He was 47 years old. His deathbed proclamation urged South Americans to abandon partisan conflict, writing in paraphrase that if his death contributed to the end of strife and the consolidation of union, he would go to his grave in peace. The continent did not take his advice. His remains were returned to Caracas in 1842 and now lie in the National Pantheon of Venezuela. The estate where he died is now a museum, which seems like the least that could be offered to a man who gave everything he had and died watching it dissolve. Shaka Zulu. Shaka Zulu transformed the Zulu from a minor clan in southern Africa into the most formidable military force on the continent through a revolution in tactics and organization that military historians still analyze today. He developed the Iklewa, a shortened stabbing spear designed for close combat rather than throwing, paired with a large cowhide shield. And he drilled his regiments into units of remarkable discipline and coordination. His signature tactical formation, the bullhorn, divided his army into a central chest that engaged the enemy frontally, while 2 flanking horns, swept around to encircle them, was devastatingly effective against virtually everyone he fought. He built the Zulu kingdom from a few thousand people into an empire of perhaps 250,000 by the time of his death, having absorbed or destroyed dozens of neighboring chieftains in a period of regional upheaval the Zulu call the Mfecane. He was assassinated on September 22, 1828, stabbed from behind at his royal kraal at Kwadukuza, in what is now Stanger in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. The killers were his own half-brothers, Dingaan and Mlangana, who almost certainly had the cooperation of his personal servant Mbopa. The assassination came after a period of increasingly erratic and brutal behavior following the death of his mother Nandi in 1827, to whom Shaka, had been deeply devoted. Early European sources, including Henry Francis Finn and Nathaniel Isaacs, both of whom were present in Zulu territory at the time, and whose accounts are the primary written record but must be read with awareness of their biases, describe the mourning period Shaka imposed as extreme. Crops not planted, cattle not milked, women found pregnant killed along with their husbands. The degree to which these accounts are accurate versus embellished by European writers with their own agendas is a genuine historiographical debate. A popular tradition records Shaka's last words as a prophecy: "You will not rule this land after killing me, the swallows will," interpreted as a reference to the European colonization that would indeed follow within decades, though this account is likely apocryphal. Dingaane took the throne and proved unable to resist the combination of Boer settlers and British imperial pressure, and within 60 years of Shaka's death, the independent Zulu kingdom was gone. Adolf Hitler built the Third Reich through a combination of electoral politics and coordinated violence, came to absolute power in Germany by 1934, and between 1939 and 1942 achieved the military conquest of most of continental Europe, from the English Channel to the suburbs of Moscow, a territorial dominance not seen since Napoleon. He died in a hole in the ground beneath a burning city. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet forces fighting building by building approximately 300 meters from the Reich Chancellery above, Hitler was in the Führer bunker, a reinforced concrete structure roughly 8 meters underground, where he had been living for months. The previous day, he had married Eva Braun. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, he shot himself in the right temple with his Walther PPK pistol, while simultaneously, or in immediate succession, biting down on a cyanide capsule, a dual method apparently chosen as insurance, since he had witnessed what he believed was cyanide's failure in the case of Hermann Fegelein, who had not died immediately. Eva Braun died of cyanide alone. Their bodies were carried by staff to the Reich Chancellery garden above, drenched in petrol and set alight. Artillery fire and fuel shortages meant the cremation was incomplete. Soviet forces arrived and recovered the remains shortly after. Soviet forensic teams examined the body and identified it partly through dental records matched against evidence provided by Hitler's dentist, Hugo Blaschka, and his dental assistant, Kata Heusermann. The Soviet Union then kept the fate of the remains deliberately obscure for decades. A decision that directly fueled the explosion of Hitler survival conspiracy theories that persisted through the rest of the 20th century. In 2018, French forensic scientists were given access to teeth held in Russian archives and conducted a detailed analysis confirming that the dental morphology matched Hitler's known dental records precisely, putting the survival theories to rest for anyone engaging with the evidence. The Goebbels family also died in the bunker, with Magda Goebbels killing her 6 children before she and her husband took their own lives. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, 8 days after Hitler's death, ending a war that had killed an estimated 70 to 85 million people. Saddam Hussein ruled Iraq for 24 years. Short fought an 8-year war with Iran that killed hundreds of thousands of people, invaded Kuwait in 1990, used chemical weapons against Kurdish civilians at Halabja in 1988, killing an estimated 3,000 to 5,000 people in a single attack, and built a cult of personality so pervasive that his face appeared on buildings, currency, and monuments across every Iraqi city. He was found hiding in a hole in the ground near a farmhouse outside Tikrit, his hometown, on December 13, 2003, 8 months after the U.S.-led invasion that toppled his government. The contrast between the image he had cultivated, the grandiose murals, the gold-plated weapons, the enormous parades, and the disheveled, long-bearded man pulled from a narrow underground spider hole was not subtle, and images of his medical examination in the hours after his capture circulated globally within hours. His trial before the Iraqi Special Tribunal was defiant throughout. He refused to recognize the court's legitimacy, challenged the legality of the proceedings, and maintained that he was the rightful president of Iraq, a position he held until the rope. He was convicted of crimes against humanity related to the Dujail massacre of 1982, in which he ordered the killing of 148 Shia Muslims following an assassination attempt against him during a visit to the town. He was sentenced to death by hanging. The execution took place at Camp Justice, a former Iraqi military intelligence facility in Baghdad, on December 30, 2006 at dawn. He reportedly refused a hood, recited the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith, and showed no visible fear according to witnesses. The execution was recorded on a mobile phone by someone present, and the footage, which showed officials and guards taunting Hussein in his final moments, was leaked online within hours. The international reaction to the footage focused heavily on the taunting rather than the execution itself, with numerous governments and observers condemning the proceedings as undignified. Show a response that added another layer of controversy to an already deeply contested event. The execution fell on or immediately adjacent to Eid al-Adha, the most significant Islamic holiday of the year, and the timing intensified outrage across Sunni Muslim communities internationally, with many viewing it as a deliberate sectarian provocation. He was buried in Auja, near Tikrit, in a grave that was later damaged in the violence that followed the invasion. The power vacuum his removal created contributed directly to the sectarian civil war that consumed Iraq in subsequent years, and to the conditions that produced the Islamic State. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.